So yes, we do have another psychology talk now with Psychology with Disruptive Technology. So, and that's Lorraine is going to be coming in for that. I'm going to promote you now, Lorraine. Here we go. Oh, there's Lorraine now. Yeah, hi, and Louise can. Let's see here now, Louise.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Lorraine. How are you?
I'm good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you absolutely fine. Yes. So you're going to be talking today about, and you're very welcome, Lorraine. Dr. Lorraine Bourne is the Assistant Professor of Psychology and lectures Cognitive Psychology and Law and Neuroscience as well in the School of Psychology. So you're going to be giving a little bit of talk about today about the other new course in psychology, which is Psychology with Disruptive Technology, which is also very fascinating. So I'll let you get on with that, Louise, or sorry, Lorraine, if you wish there. So
Perfect.
I'm just going to.
Thank you so much. And that was a fantastic talk as well by Louise. So I'm going to bounce off some of the ideas that Louise spoke about as well. So with psychology and disruptive technologies, so we focus, of course, on really important aspects of psychology. So cognition, that's thinking, biological, so the brain and the body. And we also look at how the person acts, behaves within a broader social context. And we also look at how the person develops, across the lifespan. And we also look at how technology is kind of informing those relationships. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that will work. And maybe you can just let me know that you can see my screen.
It's coming in now. Loading, so it should be okay.
Perfect.
It's not there yet. Yes, indeed. Here we are now.
Great. So what I wanted to chat to you today is a little bit about the role of technology and in particular how it impacts the brain. So we study lots of different areas when we're looking at psychology and disruptive technologies, because these types of technologies are just driving change in how we interface with people, like right now, so online, how we communicate, how we can diagnose but also predict diseases and disorders much earlier in time, how we can intervene. And here, when we're looking at psychological function, can we even enhance typical function beyond what we would expect, and in some ways even beyond what legal as well as illegal drugs can do in terms of effects on the brain. Technology is revolutionizing so many markets, but that includes how we do education, how we do healthcare. So we're looking at all of those points at which technology interfaces with psychology. So I'll talk a little bit about the degree as well, but I just wanted to give you a taster for some of the big issues. The degree is going to take you through all of the key areas of study in psychology. It's going to take you through all the key areas of studying computing, so that you can write in different languages, develop web applications, and then combine that, because that skill set is so valued going forward. We know, and if the pandemic has taught us anything, that it's really important to understand the psychology behind, in particular, behavior change, what motivates people to act in certain ways, and how you can nudge or even change behaviors such as health behaviors. And we collect so much data from people, from personal types of data, so their health, their brain function, but data like someone's gender, their age, and so on. All of this information combined together is quite powerful. It can help us predict things about your behavior in the future. And when we go to look at some of the brain technology, can read activity in different areas of your brain, and on the basis of that, predict what you're about to decide before you are aware of it, before you can tell us that you are about to make that decision. So we know that data, information is so important. And from a computational or math perspective, you can see how that is really important. And here it's looking at the technology, but asking the big question: just because we can do all of these things with technology, so predict your behavior in the future, alter different states in the brain that might have impacts on something as fundamental as your personality, your belief system. Just because we can do all of these things, should we really be doing it? So one of the things we're going to look at here is privacy's final frontier. So the ethical issues of, in particular, neuroscience. This is understanding the brain. So I have to start with Elon Musk. So when we're talking about being able to develop, so drive these innovative ideas, this innovation in technology to be able to, in a sense, read the mind. So be able to capture, we've been able to measure activity in the brain, and it can be down to when in the brain is certain activity happening, and also where in the brain is activity happening. And when we correlate it with what you're doing, the different functions. So are you reading right now? Are we asking you to read? Are we asking you to memorize something and recall? Are we presenting a picture of someone's face and saying, do you recognize that person or not? When we're looking at brain activity and we correlate it with something, a function, so it could be memory, language, recognition, any of these things, we're learning quite a bit. We're gathering a lot of data about your brain and your behavior. So what if that technology can measure activity in the brain and be able to communicate with an external technology outside of your body that can act on your behalf? What if? And the thing is, this is not future science, this isn't speculation. Right now, Musk and others have developed, they're piloting these technologies, and very often in these types of fields, you have pilot work in animal studies, and it's ethically approved, and eventually it moves on into human trials. But right now, that's what they're doing. They're at that very early or nascent phase of looking at how you can read the brain. And the big question is, of course, is if an individual cannot exercise, cannot communicate on their own behalf, they cannot make an action, a movement, or vocalize their will or their preference or what they want to do. But by reading their brain signals, a technology can do that. So can move on their behalf, can articulate what they're thinking or what their preference is. How great would that be? So, in a way that would be supporting an individual's autonomy. But one of the bigger questions here is placing ethics at the core of this as well. So there is this unexplored continent lying between the fields of ethics and of brain science or neuroscience. So when we're looking at how you can measure and visually represent activity in the brain, so remember we said when in time as well as where in the brain, and we combine that, and then we associate that with something you're doing, a function, we're learning quite a lot, and we can reverse engineer that so that we can, by reading brain signals, predict what you are about to do. And these types of breakthrough technologies are being piloted right now. And the Neuralink, so Musk's version of this approach is what we call a brain-machine interface. So this is a machine learning, so it's an algorithm-based platform that can measure activity in the brain, and on the basis of that can communicate with an external technology that can, in theory and probably in practice fairly soon, act on someone's behalf. So a lot of the early work is clinical work, and the thinking is, can we use this to rehabilitate an individual? So where someone cannot move, so their brain cannot control right now voluntary motor movements, could such a platform help a technology to act on a person's behalf? But of course, there is this trajectory of going from the clinical all the way to the commercial. So where a company could provide this type of platform where it can be used for lots of different services, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's to do with rehabilitation. So when we look at these types of technologies, when psychologists come into this type of a conversation, they're looking at, of course, the ethics, the governance, and the psychological issues around these technologies. And these types of technologies really they're an ethics maze. So and one I love this quote. It's kind of like a Fitbit in your skull with tiny wires. So measuring this type of activity, being able to log it, being able to build up a lot of information over time about you, and then being able to use it to then control another technology on your behalf. So it's impressive. So this audacious vision of a smartphone controlled brain machine interface obviously has so many potential benefits, but there could be risks. And there's some really nice talks that if you want to outlink to being shared on a recording and so on, you can check that out further. So really, when we, from a psychological perspective, when we come into this conversation, we're looking at technology, but we're also looking at the brain. So very often when we are understanding behavior and the brain, we look at what we call typical brains. So measuring activity across many, many individuals and averaging that gives us a sense of typical brain activity and typical function. But we have to understand that brains, people, are diverse. So similar to the concept of biodiversity, we have neurodiversity. So it's respecting that as well. So understanding that many of the algorithms and the models that are produced when we're trying to understand, how does motor cognition work, or how do we perceive in the brain, they're typically based on averaging normative or typical performance. But it's really important that we also look at neurodiverse brains as well. So that means that respecting diversity is important in developing these algorithms, but also looking at the use. So if you look at Neuralink and these types of technologies, the early pitch, the early idea is this notion of rehabilitation. So being able to bring an individual back to this typical function. So the way they were potentially before stroke, before a traumatic brain injury, before an event. So there are very laudable and very good points that are emphasized under a rehabilitation framework, and in particular that someone's autonomy or their independence is supported. So having an interface that is just as simple as the smart technology in your phone that can help you communicate with others in your environment, when right now, because of brain damage or other factors, you're unable to do it. That of course is a benefit. That is something to that is worthwhile, something to be praised. But there are also inherent risks to implanting devices within the brain, and also looking at how these devices are not just passive recipients of just measuring activity, but they in turn may alter activity in the brain. So they may over time change the brain in terms of ultimately behavior. And of course, one of the questions is, if we learn a lot from a rehabilitation perspective, could it be applied where, in a sense, we can soup up the brain or we enhance the brain? So cognitive enhancement. So there are different ways of doing this, approaching it from a pharmacological perspective, but there's a technological aspect to this as well, where technologies can boost activity in the brain, in particular the prefrontal region, that can really help with really important cognitive functions, from memory to how you pay attention, and you were learning about that earlier, to how you represent information in the brain, to how quickly you can search that. And all of these core components, they're almost like the brain CEO, these executive components, are really, really important in intelligence. So in a sense, can we push the next stage of development to this kind of superior level of intelligence or enhancement. And there are ethics associated with that. So if that is possible, what does that mean? Access to that type of technology, and what would be the effects? But let's cast back to this notion of deep brain stimulation. So inserting electrodes in the brain and not only being able to read the brain, so on the basis of activity in the brain, be able to transform that into important information. So reading the brain so that someone can move, to produce movement. Quite a lot has been done, of course, in that field of research. But when it comes to psychological phenomena, so mood, for example, the relationship between deep brain stimulation and the effects or the changes in psychological aspects like mood is just much more inexact. And what we know about these types of technologies and what you'll learn in the course is that machine learning underpins the ability to the processing interface between the person's brain and the technology that essentially acts on their behalf. But there is an element of the unknown, because in a sense, you're building up these algorithms, which are these step-by-step processes or a series of decisions that are processing raw brain activity into an outcome, and so that a technology produces some result on your behalf. So what happens if it does something? Are you ultimately the owner of that response? So are you responsible if it acts in a criminal way? Are you liable? So there are all of these ethical and other issues that are being questioned, of course. And in terms of that unknown, so how it affects psychological aspects of the person, a lot of these decision making, so algorithms, so these steps, these processing steps, have an impact ultimately on our sense of self and self-governance. So some of these decision making steps are called closed loop. So for example, who makes the decision in this algorithm that maybe being happy, achieving a state of happiness is good, but being sad is, well, not good or bad? Because we know in social contexts that it can be appropriate to be sad. So for example, if one is grieving, that negative affect or that sadness is appropriate. But if the aim of the technology is to boost mood, so therefore it is managing mood so that it is more positive than negative, what types of decisions are being made in this algorithm and by whom, such that the technology can have that persuasive effect or that behavioral effect? And there's this notion of hybrid agency. So if the technology is acting on your behalf, the sense of agency, of ownership of what you do, of your body, is part you and part technology. And there's an issue of, well, who's ultimately responsible if something happens? What if there's an unintended consequence? I mean, most of these algorithms are developed so that they are predicting a certain outcome, so that you can move in a certain way or that you can articulate your decision. But what if there are unintended consequences that we find out about in terms of how it might have other effects on other aspects of the brain and ultimately behavior? And of course, these ethical questions can be asked before we do this type of research. So if we step forward to more advanced brain type interface technologies, there's some really important, great articles that you can click into. So like The Guardian had one on this idea that with these technologies being able to capture such important brain information, we're talking about brain activity, so when and where in the brain, and being able to merge it with other aspects of our life, so life logging, even important demographic, information, like I said, your age, gender, and so on. Perhaps this notion of privacy is being seriously eroded. So we have the right not to say something. We have the right to keep, of course, and when I say that, I'm not talking legally so to speak, but that we can keep our thoughts to ourselves. So we can think lots of things, but we may not articulate it. So we keep it private. And within legal jurisdictions and legal frameworks, we have a right to privacy, like in the home and so on. And there are lots of safeguards for that. But when it comes to this notion of mental privacy or cognitive privacy, not every, legal framework will be able to protect, against invasion of your privacy. So if we take another type of technology like BrainCom, it really it puts into, I think, our minds this notion that privacy is a redundant concept, because if this technology can learn to read our minds, even in the absence of you saying anything, it can, the pattern of activity in your brain is betraying potentially that you recognize someone, or that you recall an event, or that you're about to make a decision, even though you may not be aware that you're about to make that decision. So it calls into question this notion of brain rights or neuro rights. So for some, they're seriously talking about this notion of a digital right to expression. So BrainCom and other types of companies are developing these technology interfaces, typically for patients who, because of a particular disease burden or brain state, are unable to communicate or move or exercise that type of autonomy that we all do in our everyday life. So being able to use the brain information, so where someone is alert, is able to process, is able to, in a sense, send those motor commands to do something, but it's the technology that enacts that decision on the person's behalf. Then can we protect that? Can we also protect the person in the situation where the technology is having an effect that we never thought possible on their brain? So these are the, the unpredicted, the incidental effects. And building a technology as part of the body has an impact on your self-identity and this notion of integrity. So who is processing all this data? So if by virtue of the fact that you are a patient and you elect, to have this technology fitted, or if you are a consumer and you use this technology because it can enhance your life experience, where are all of those data? Where is that information going? So who else could use it? Is it creating any dependency so that you need this technology to continue to sustain a particular way of behaving? And do you have any rights with regard to that technology? And another issue is, and I'm taking a quote here, you can see it at the bottom of the screen, this notion that these types of technologies create this kind of a firewall between the brain, so the person, of course, and the technology that acts on their behalf. But how can we guard against intrusion and alteration of the brain and ultimately someone's behavior based on that firewall? So it really does call into question this notion of privacy, given the advances that are made in terms of technology in the brain. So some of the work that I do and that we dip into in the course is looking at, well, what can this technology do and how can it be applied? So one of the areas that I'm really interested in is law and neuroscience. So this is a snapshot from a paper. You can see all of these papers are very, very recent, but it's looking at how a particular measure of activity in the brain, this is called the P300. So this is something that happens very quickly, within 300 milliseconds in the brain. So it is a signature, a brain activity signature in the brain, but this is useful information. So it can help predict whether you're concealing information. So are you trying to deceive? And you can probably immediately think, well, maybe criminal courts would be interested in that, or if you're being interrogated, because it's thought that you're an alleged perpetrator, they might be interested in whether you're telling the truth or not. So there are lots of different case studies. I'll talk very quickly through two of where technology can be used and can impact on thinking. So like I said, with these types of technologies, they're collecting data on where in the brain activity is happening, but also when. Is it very, very quickly? So like, you're perceiving information, or is it much more later on in terms of time? So it's taking seconds. So, this information is being used maybe for something that requires effort. It's decision-making type thinking. And when that's combined, so it's spatiotemporal information, and it's linked to something you're doing, a function, well, how powerful is that information, and what can it be used to do? Well, that type of brain imaging can be used to predict, as I said, false memory in the courtroom. Now, it's not admitted as evidence in most jurisdictions because it hasn't reached a level of, confidence, we'll use that term, but reliability, validity that it needs in order to be trusted evidence. And part of the issue is around public acceptability. So this notion that these types of technologies can be used to predict something like this, that you are concealing something that you want to keep private, that information could be used in something like a criminal case. And what's the ethics around it? So, are you consenting to this information, to be collected and to be used in this way? And what if you try and beat the test, so to speak? So if you act or behave in a certain way so that you can fool the test, well, what of that? Can they detect these, what we call countermeasures? Another area that we're very interested in, and it's a really hot topic, is developing these types of technologies to support decision making. So sometimes we can lose what's called its legal capacity to make a decision. Now, it can be, that concern can be triggered for a number of reasons. It's not down or just down to whether you have a particular type of brain disease or disorder. It can be down to a whole number of factors. But if there is a situation where you may not be able or may not have capacity to fully understand the nature and the consequences of your decision right now, can we develop technology to support your decision making so that you are at the heart of it, the decision maker, your will and preference is respected, and it's not like a more traditional scenario of where someone else steps in to make a decision on your behalf. So essentially your autonomy, your sense of independence is taken away. So there are lots of technologies that can help with this type of decision support, but of course there are ethical and legal challenges as well. Who ultimately is making this decision? Another area that's interesting and that we dip into is the use of artificial intelligence and what we call big data. So when we're pulling data from many very, very large databases, these could be longitudinal. That means over a long period of time, data is being collected by many different sites across many different people. And when this type of brain data is merged and pulled together, certain patterns can be observed, and it's the patterns that are observed, which we call modeling, can be of interest because it can be used to predict the risk of something happening. So it hasn't already, but you might be at risk. So using artificial intelligence, for example, to model thinking and predicting your ability to think in 10 years time or 15 years time, and could you potentially be at risk of developing a particular type of brain disease or disorder, such as dementia, for example. So there has been a lot of work done looking at being able to predict someone's thinking, so their cognitive function, based on something as simple as how they write, based on something as simple as the language they're using, what features of language are they using. So, and you can check this out if you want to dip into, this is a Scientific American article, but this is where artificial intelligence has been used to assess the risk of developing Alzheimer's dementia by looking at how people are using words, their expression. So, what does someone who has a healthy status, what's their word usage like? Someone who has maybe mild cognitive impairment versus where they have a dementia status. So these types of technologies have really, really been advanced. But there are some questions. And when we're looking from a psychological perspective, and I'm going into closing now, so I hope I'm keeping on time. Apologies if I'm not. But adopting a technology, there are probably 5 big factors. By the way, this isn't a published model. This is just, and I really want to try and keep it F, so I work really hard for this. But I think the first is to look at function or facilitative. So is this technology being designed to target a particular function? So it could be a cognitive, a brain function. And does it facilitate the person in doing it? So is it assistive? So is it assisting the person, or is it, in a sense, supporting the person and at the same time creating a state of dependency? Is the central idea that this can rehabilitate the person, so it's rehabilitative? Or are we talking about someone who is typical functioning, but that we're looking at enhancing the person's performance? So almost like this notion of super intelligence. The other is fit. So how is this technology designed around the person and their environment? So is it so that the technology becomes part of, well, it's like a habit. It just fits into their life. So they don't even notice it anymore. It's very user-centered. It's not so complex or has such a poor fit that it takes a lot of effort and probably won't. Within 10 or 15 or 20 days, that technology will not be part of their life. So they won't keep it up. The fear, the fun. So it's kind of like an emotion. What are the psychological motivators that we're tapping into when we design technologies? So the fun factor is, if you gamify something, it's fun. People like being competitive. They like earning points. And this, in a way, can help a technology become integrated into their life, or help support a function because it's enjoyable, it's fun. Or if it could be pressing the fear button. So if you don't have this technology in your life, it's just going to create more anxiety around how much control you have in your environment or your body and so on. The fourth F is feedback. So any of these types of technologies, if they're assisting you or if they're acting on your behalf, have to be responsive to your needs. So if something is not working for you, or it has these, in a sense, side effects, all of this has to be noted, and the person has to be at the center of the design process. We call this co-design, and ultimately has to be able to trust in the technology and know that something as important as their privacy, which we've been talking a good bit about, is respected, because these types of technologies tap into really, really important personal data, and the way they're processed and the way they can be used can predict and can control ultimately behaviors that are important to us. And of course, lots of different stakeholders might have a vested interest in knowing about that as well. And the last F is fringe. I was really searching for the last F, but this is to do with the ethical concerns about tapping into what we call the reward systems. It's linked a little bit to the fun factor. So some of these technologies can really change your behavior. They can alter your behavior, but they do it on the principle of tapping into a region of the brain that responds to kind of positive feedback, or what we call appetitive type behaviors. So we know that food and drink and lots of different activities like that are rewarding. They're inherently rewarding. So if you pair a technology with a reward-based behavior, it can really be embedded and really, really impact on behavior. But is it a nudge too far? So even though psychologically we know that this can really facilitate technology and impacting on behavior, ethically should we be doing it? The second big question as we go into close as well here is looking at the ethical issues. So throughout the degree, we'll really be tapping into this because, you know, this is such a new area, but we're bringing in psychology, like I said, we're bringing in computing and that integrated pathway. So looking at these cognitive technologies in particular, and how does it support what we call cognitive liberty? So the ability, the freedom to think, and your autonomy, your sense of independence and agency, and also your privacy. So, you know, you have that right to not disclose, to keep thoughts private. But what are these technologies doing, and what kind of impacts are they having? And of course, these technologies potentially can manipulate or coerce behavior, not because they inherently want to, it's because of the algorithms, the programming, the processing in the background. So we need to be aware of that. And there can be unintended outcomes. As with any intervention, there are intended and unintended. We need to track that and you know, be on top of that and even predict forward how that could happen. And there are vulnerability concerns. So when we're looking at technologies for individuals who are vulnerable by reason of either their status, and it could be their brain status at any time, and we can, any one of us can experience vulnerability at any period throughout our lives. We want to make sure that these technologies address vulnerability concerns. And the notion of bias is really important. If these types of processing, or what we call algorithms, are developed based on typical performance, but they don't bring in the important questions of diversity, well, then they are biased. And if they don't take into account even brain diversity, then there are issues. So it can lead to a situation of privilege where some individuals have access to these technologies and can experience further enhancement, and others don't. So we need to look at that, and what does that mean? So some really interesting papers here if you were interested, and you can try and click out to those. And the last is to do with persuasion and change. You know, sometimes the aim of an intervention is to change behavior in a positive way, a way that is accepted by all, including the individual, that this is positive for them. So they can be persuaded, or sometimes it is a nudge. It's not as direct or as explicit. But we have to look at how these technologies are changing behavior. So I think this kind of tells it all. I guess I was surprised by an app telling an adult they had to go to bed before 10:30. So this is looking at some of the experiences of individuals and with these types of technologies, and you know, what is deemed the positive behavior, and how it nudges, and you know, how it taps into, like I said, systems, including the reward system, to be able to change, so that you can change your behavior, so to be able to support behavior change. So here in DCU, so it's not just in this degree, but in DCU, this is really important. Psychology, disruptive technologies, and the notion of ethics, that we build, that the person is always central to these big questions. And it flows outward. It's not just about the individual either. There's also the greater societal impact. So how these technologies are governed. So you can see here, you know, as Irish and also as Europeans, we can see that the Council of Europe is seriously looking at this. So how can these neurotechnologies be applied, and you know, should we be thinking about how they should be regulated? They're looking at that. There are lots of different jurisdictions that are actually seriously looking at what we call digital rights as well. So I think our degree is so new in that it is combining all of these really, really important areas that you'd probably have to wait until postgrad to be able to study separately. So we're looking at the psychology and all the core areas, the core streams. We're looking at building up these computing skills so that you can interface, you can understand the people, and also the skill set that's important within this field. And then you look at that intersection between psychology and disruptive technologies. So this unique skill set that kind of puts you at the fore of practice, of teaching and research in this area, and all of the applied areas as well. So I think, Colette, that's taking me to the end of that taster lecture. I hope I haven't gone over time. I'm sorry, I wasn't.
You're grand, you're grand. No, we have been over time all afternoon, so don't worry about that. Thanks so much, Lorraine. That was absolutely fascinating. And the whole topic is just so interesting, as well as the psychology and math psychology and disruptive technology, psychology on it by itself. There's so many different elements to it, isn't there? There's like, you know, you just hit, you're like, that's just a tiny element of what you just described there of the whole psychology.
Exactly, of that whole interface, and it's showing how psychology really is at the core, that sometimes we forget about the person and the person in society, and this type of degree just brings it all together.
Absolutely does. So thank you again so much. We don't have any questions, so I can let you go get off, but we do have a student ambassador, or a student from psychology and disruptive technology on our panel discussion later on, so they can reiterate everything you said and talk about their own experiences of the course as well. So we hope that our visitors will join us for that. But in the meantime, Lorraine, thank you so much for your talk here today. It was, like I said,
thank you so much for the invite. I really enjoyed it, and wish everyone a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks again, Lorraine. Bye-bye.